Protests in Bangladesh take another violent turn as demonstrators return to the streets to demand Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's resignation.
Local media say at least 91 people have been killed, including more than a dozen policemen, the largest single-day toll since protests began last month. Police fired tear gas and lobbed stun grenades to disperse thousands of demonstrators. The streets turned into a battleground as protesters and pro-government groups clash in the capital Dhaka and at least 11 other districts.
The demonstrators blocked major highways, torched vehicles near schools and hospitals, as well as offices of the ruling Awami League Party. Protesters have launched a so-called non-cooperation effort, urging citizens not to pay taxes and utility bills, and told overseas workers to stop sending remittances home.
আমার সামনে দেখি 5টা লাশ আসছে এরকম ছেলের দেখি মাথায় বুলেট এই জায়গা থেকে মাংস উঠে গেছে মানে আমি ভাবতে পারি না যে আমার দেশে এরকম মানে যুদ্ধ আমার নিজেদের মানুষের মধ্যে দেখতে হবে মানে লাশের পর লাশ আমি মানে কি করব সবাই ওখানে হাত পেতে দোয়া করে
কিন্তু আমরা চাই যে এই সরকার মনে করেন পদত্যাগ করুন এবং এই দেশটা সুন্দর মিলে আবার যে আমরা আগের মতো চলাফেরা করতে পারি এই জন্যই আজকে আমরা রাজপথে এসেছি
An indefinite nationwide curfew has come into force across the country. A 3-day general holiday begins today and a mobile internet shutdown is again in place. Human rights groups have accused Sheikh Hasina's government of using excessive force, something officials have denied. The Prime Minister said those who are carrying out violence were terrorists and urged the people to deal with them with a strong hand.
The deadly protests began last month as student-led demonstrations over a quota system that was believed to favor supporters of the ruling party. As the violence escalated, the Supreme Court cut the quota to 5% from 30%. But more than 200 people had already died, and now the protests have morphed into a broader anti-government movement, seeking an end to Hasina's long reign in power. The Prime Minister has governed Bangladesh since 2009 and has faced accusations of misusing state institutions to stamp dissent. The demonstrators have reportedly announced a march to capital Dhaka today to push for Sheikh Hasina-led government's resignation.
For more on this developing situation, we're joined once again by Michael Kugelman, who is director of the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center. Michael, good to have you back on the show. Let me start by asking you why this week has been described as crucial. What's going to happen over the next few days, Michael?
Well, Monday is a critical day in that leaders of the protests have called for the nation to converge on the capital, Dhaka. The protesters have a lot of momentum. They're very angry, but they're also confident knowing that a good part of the nation is behind them. So I think that we will see large numbers of people marching on Dhaka in the coming days. However, the government has taken a very hard line against the protesters, and indeed it's been cracking down very hard on protesters. And as was noted before in your report, the Prime Minister has described the protesters as anarchists and terrorists. So neither side is willing to sit down and compromise, negotiate. The government has offered to negotiate, but the protest leaders have said no. So I fear that it's been a very bloody few weeks, and indeed Sunday was the bloodiest day yet, with nearly 100 people killed. But I fear that this confrontation could grow even more in the next few days if you start having more and more people coming out onto the streets marching on the Capitol.
Not only marching on the streets, Michael, but protesters are urging citizens not to pay taxes or utility bills, calling for shutdown of all factories and public transport as well. Just how effective would this be as a tactic? And just how far do you think the protests will go?
Well, this is the problem that the protesters, who are for the most part peaceful, are taking very hard lines, and because of the anger, we've seen protesters staging violence, and indeed they're essentially hoping to shut the entire capital down and great parts of the country down as well. And the government, I think, would simply exploit that to validate their narrative, which they have been putting out there for quite some time, that these protests have been hijacked by unsavory characters, by criminals, and so on. But I'll say this: that what we've seen over the last few weeks is that the protests, which have largely remained peaceful, have earned significant levels of public support, and that is because of the way in which the government has cracked down. I mean, in recent weeks, we had about 200 deaths, most of them caused by police forces and other state security forces cracking down hard. Children have died. UNICEF came out with a report in recent days saying about 30 children had died in these protests over the last few weeks. So I think that because the protest leaders and the protesters know that they have a lot of public support, that will embolden them. That will keep them going as well. So, and of course, we'll see how the government responds to that. I don't think the government is in the mood to be conciliatory.
So no chance at all, Michael, that Sheikh Hasina is going to step down as the leaders are demanding?
I don't think so. Not yet. I mean, now keep in mind that Sheikh Hasina is a very strong, stubborn leader, and this is a political persona that she's forged from her past, a very tragic past. Much of her family, her immediate family, was killed in an assassination by Bangladeshi military officers when she was in her 20s, when she was out of the country, and she's become this very strong leader who has taken a very strong line on so many things. And given that she has depicted these protests as having been hijacked by thugs and anarchists and terrorists, the last thing she would want to do is step down, because that would be perceived as essentially caving into to the types of characters that she has claimed to want to go after. But that said, things could reach a point where it becomes untenable for her to remain in power, and she has lost significant numbers of supporters. Many of the economic elite have turned against her. Industrialists have turned against her, and indeed, in recent days, this is very problematic for Sheikh Hasina. Some elements, retired senior and mid-level military officers, have criticized this campaign, this crackdown. So, if she feels that she's losing support, she may not want to step down, but someone might essentially try to convince her to step down in favor of an interim government. And I think that call might come from the likes of the military in Bangladesh, which supports Hasina at this point. But my view is that for now, in the immediate term, the next few days, she's going to try to stick it out. But things could reach a point where it becomes untenable for her to stay in power.
Michael, some experts say, those expecting liberal democracy to flourish in a post-Hasina Bangladesh will almost certainly be disappointed. Would you agree? And any idea who might be poised to replace her should the government be overthrown?
Right. There's a lot of uncertainty right now. I think that the most likely option, if she were to step down, and really the most desirable option, because it would be the most peaceful and stable outcome, would be for power to be handed over to some type of interim setup, led by perhaps the president of Bangladesh, a ceremonial position, or some other group of political figures. Then that would then lead to elections, to free and fair elections. There was an election in Bangladesh earlier this year, but it was boycotted by the opposition. Many didn't see it as free and fair. The opposition in Bangladesh, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, the other major political party in addition to Sheikh Hasina's Awami League, does not have a good track record at all when it comes to good governance and respect for human rights and democracy. When the BNP has been in power in the past, you've had terrible levels of repression and corruption, to be quite frank. So indeed, if Hasina were to leave, if there were to be elections, and if the current opposition were to come to power, I don't think that things would become more democratic and so on, particularly because given the polarization in Bangladeshi politics right now, I think there's a strong chance that if the opposition were to become the party in power, that it would stage acts of retribution against those that had been in power before and that had cracked down on the BNP for so long. So it's really a very messy situation at this point. But I think for now, in the immediate term, the best outcome, if she were to step down, if the prime minister were to step down, would to be some type of temporary government that essentially holds down the fort until the country is ready for elections.
Meantime, Michael, India calling the protests an internal matter. Being a key player and possibly the biggest power in the region, shouldn't New Delhi be doing something? Is there a reason why it's standing back for now?
Well, New Delhi is a very close friend of Dhaka, and the two leaders, Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Prime Minister Hasina, they share a lot in common, particularly ideological convergences. They both view the current opposition in Bangladesh as a dangerous, destabilizing Islamist force. These are the terms that both countries use to describe the opposition. So I think that the Indians would like to see Sheikh Hasina somehow ride this out. But I think if things get to a point in Bangladesh where India concludes that Hasina staying in power could become so destabilizing for Bangladesh that it starts to threaten India's security interests, particularly if, for example, you have threats of attacks on Indian interests or personnel in Bangladesh, then perhaps the Indian government would gently try to call on Hasina to step down. This would all be done privately. But I think that at this point, yes, I mean, the Indians are probably the most important external player when it comes to Bangladesh's crisis, because it's New Delhi that has the most influence and potentially leverage over a leader who really does not want to step down.
Michael, we leave it there. Thank you very much for your time and for your thoughts this morning. Michael Kugelman is director at the South Asia Institute at the Wilson Center.